Some of you may remember April 11th, 1970, when an oxygen tank failed aboard the 13th Apollo mission, putting in danger Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Hayes. More of you will remember from the movie starring Tom Hanks, which is what I remember it from. The problem was that the carbon dioxide in the capsule was now rising dangerously. The mission had already been scrubbed. There was no way they could land on the moon, but they had to go around the moon and then come back. And they ran into an issue. This is a classic problem. They had a square peg in a round hole. These square lithium hydroxide canisters from the command module didn't fit the round opening for the same piece in the landing module. The engineers that designed the one were probably not the same ones that designed the others, so they had square and round. They fixed that afterwards and said, no more, they all have to be interchangeable. At that point, engineers down at Mission Control were the only hope, and they figured out a way to attach these square boxes using bags, plastic bags and tape. That's what the top right with the tape on it is what they came up with. They affixed it to the hole, and it worked well enough that all three astronauts survived. But obviously, and that's a famous scene in the movie, right? We got to fix this using only this, and the guy dumps out the pieces. And that's from the movie on the bottom, obviously. They weren't filming in the room at the time. Consider the request put upon those engineers to solve a problem in little time with little to work with. And we'll take a look at Gospel of Mark, chapter 6, beginning in verse 30. It says, the apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all they had done and taught. Here the narrative is picking up from where it left off in chapter 6, verse 13. Remember, last week we dealt with the martyrdom of John the Baptist. And here we return to where the 12 came back to Jesus after their mission, and they report to him what had happened. This is a reminder for us, the reader, of the recent success the disciples had. It's the way of Mark to frame what is about to happen in the light of the success they just had. The 12 have recently driven out demons. They've healed the sick. They've preached the coming of the kingdom of God in the name of Jesus. And so now as our text unfolds, the question is, what challenge will the disciples face here, and how will they respond to it? Verse 31, then because so many people were coming and going that they didn't even have a chance to eat, he said to them, come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest. So they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place. That solitary place at the end is going to be part of a motif, part of symbolism that Mark sees here, because it's talking about the wilderness. And when in Israel you talk about the wilderness, people naturally think about the Exodus, about the time of Israel in the desert. They think about how God's presence then was by a pillar of fire and a cloud, and how God provided manna from heaven from them. And Mark is using this story to help us realize that Jesus was the presence of God. They didn't need the pillar of fire anymore. That Jesus himself was the bread of life. And he would provide for the people this day his version of manna in the desert. So let's see what's happening here. As soon as the disciples return to Jesus, they're thrust back into the intensive ministry that the massive crowds place upon them. Just before this, they were going 2 by 2 from village to village. It was a much more low-key and manageable thing. Now they are challenged with a large crowd, and they're doing crowd control, and they're trying to keep things organized around Jesus. But Jesus knows that they, like him, cannot ignore their own physical, mental, and even spiritual need for rest. We all know that you can only burn the candle at both ends for so long before you get in trouble. Click. Verse 33, but many who saw them leaving recognized them and ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of him. In this case, the crowd followed after Jesus and the disciples, so rest is not an option. I saw a parallel to this very week. The disciples are now faced with a crowd that is going to need their help. They can't walk away from that. They can't ignore that. As I mentioned earlier, on Tuesday, I went and visited the hospital and met with healthcare workers. They're not the only ones right now that are overworked and stressed. Teachers and essential workers and EMTs and all sorts of people right now going through this ongoing stress of the pandemic, knowing that if I don't do this job, nobody else will. It has to be done. And they can't afford to think just short term, just about today, because as we know, this pandemic's been going on for about a year now. If all of our plans and solutions are just for today or this week, what's going to happen next month? What's going to happen 3 months from now? So we certainly understand the kind of situation the disciples are facing. But can you really blame the crowd for coming here like this, for pursuing them and chasing after Jesus? The people recognize in Jesus the solution to two of life's most intractable problems, the aches and pains and calamities of our frail human bodies. Jesus is healing so many people, and at the same time, he is offering the light and life of a connection to God. If you genuinely have one of those things, you're going to be swamped with people. Jesus had both of them at the same time, and so the crowds can't help themselves. I was reminded of the scene from near the end of Band of Brothers when they liberated a concentration camp. And all of the starving people are coming to the gates that are now open and hoping for food. And they're trying to pass out, pieces of cheese and pieces of bread to these people that are, some of whom look like walking skeletons. They're so deprived of nutrition. And then, of course, the Jewish soldier has to translate into German to them that they need to go back inside and that they can't eat anymore because the doctor says if you eat quickly when you're near starvation, it'll actually kill you. That's a difficult scene to watch in that series. This crowd, they're just desperate people. They're just people that have found hope and they're going to follow it anywhere, anyhow. Well, what are the disciples going to do? What is Jesus going to do first? Verse 34, when Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. We know that Jesus and his disciples needed a moment's peace. They needed rest. But that's not going to happen because these people are sheep without a shepherd. Often when we think of sheep, we have in our minds, at least those of us who aren't farmers and don't know sheep that well, we have in our minds something cute and cuddly, right? Gentle and peaceful. But that's not what this analogy is all about when Jesus says they're sheep without a shepherd. Instead, Jesus is thinking about the tendency of sheep and humanity to be helpless and lost, to get into trouble without guidance. That's exactly what we are apart from God. That is the state of this world. With all of its toils and dangers apart from God, we are absolutely sheep without a shepherd. We need help. And we need that help to come from the Good Shepherd. Notice that Jesus had compassion on them. A true shepherd feels compassion for lost sheep and works to lead them, as the 23rd Psalm tells us, to green pastures and still waters, and then bring them safely home. This crowd to Jesus is not a boon to his vanity. Jesus is not sitting there thinking, look, they love me so much, the crowd follows after me wherever I go. It didn't swell pride up in him. Nor did Jesus look at this crowd and say, what could I do with a crowd like this? Look at the power I have. How could I send them all? This crowd to Jesus is something else. Instead of selfish ends that crowds can be put to by unscrupulous leaders, Jesus focuses on how he can serve them, not on how they can serve him. How his leadership can bring solace and hope to this people. You see, that's what a shepherd does for his sheep. He cares for them. Among the things that Jesus can offer, one of the most important is truth. So he teaches them. This is not an instant solution. It wasn't just one or two things that they needed to know. It was an entire process of learning and knowing. The people had a great need of the wisdom that Jesus had to offer, and certainly we are no different. By this time, it was late in the day, so his disciples came to him. This is a remote place, they said. It's already very late. Send the people away so they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat. If you're going to try to overcome ignorance and build up a foundation of knowledge and truth, that takes a while. One afternoon was not enough time for Jesus to teach them everything they needed to know. But this large crowd can't stay here any longer in the middle of nowhere. To the disciples, the next step seems obvious. There really isn't any other choice. The people have to go home and find food along the way, or just wait till they get there. There's no other plan. Remember, this is not a planned event. All right, we're not looking at the disciples as the guys that threw a concert and then more people showed up and they didn't have enough bathrooms and they didn't have parking, and you kind of think, why didn't you plan better? They didn't plan this at all. The people just showed up. They followed Jesus here. Now, he responded with compassion by teaching them. But the time to teach them has come to an end, right? They've got to leave. That makes perfect sense from every standpoint that you could look at it. And here in the text comes the unexpected turn. We've seen this a number of times in Mark, where the narrative is going one way and then something turns it in completely another direction. Here it is. But he answered, "You give them something to eat." To which the answer is, say what now? I don't think I heard you right. I think you said that we should feed thousands of people, but that can't be right because, there are thousands of them. You got to be realistic, don't you? Optimism is one thing. I'm normally an optimist, from optimist to realist, somewhere in between, not a pessimist. But reality is still real. What on earth is Jesus thinking, telling his disciples to feed this giant crowd? So the disciples said to him, "That would take more than half a year's wages. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat?" I think the disciples deserve a little bit of credit here, because they didn't turn to Jesus and say, "You ask the impossible," right? They didn't give the Luke to Yoda response that it literally cannot be done. Instead, they said, "It's just too much. It's much too much." So they wanted to double check and make sure Jesus understood exactly what he was asking them to do. Would it make sense for you to spend half of your year's salary on a meal for a crowd that you didn't even invite to your house? Nobody would do that, right? This is a loosely organized group of guys following around a traveling rabbi. They don't have these kinds of resources. They can't afford to spend money like that haphazardly. And in reality, they probably have nowhere near that much money anyway. So Jesus asks, "How many loaves do you have? Go and see." Now, at this point, you might think that Jesus is just one of those nutty professors, right? One of those heads in the clouds academics, and he doesn't understand how much food costs, and he doesn't understand what it takes to feed a crowd. He's just asking nonsense questions, but you know that's not true. This is the son of a carpenter. He's a small town guy. He knows exactly what he's asking. So why is he asking this question? Why is he asking them how much they have? It doesn't seem to make any sense. Because the answer to this question is not going to be, well, we've got 3,000 loaves of bread and 2,000 fish. That is not what the answer is going to be. They didn't bring a wagon load, or in this sense they came by boat, a boatload full of food with them. And you want to know what? A boatload wouldn't be enough. Not to feed as many people as we're going to find out are really here. So Jesus is obviously trying to teach them some kind of lesson by asking them, "How much do you have?" But at this point in the story, the disciples have absolutely no idea what that is. What are you trying to teach us? So they just go with it for now. When they found out, they said 5 and 2 fish. 5 and 2. Do the math. That's not even enough for them. Right? There's 12 of them plus Jesus, plus they usually have other people with them, some women and some others. This amount of food is not even enough for them. They didn't even bring enough for their own dinner, let alone for anyone else. It's like a 5-year-old, and I use a 5-year-old because, it's what we got. It's like a 5-year-old coming to you with 37 cents in her hand, right? And saying, "I want to buy that doll that costs $18.99. It's enough, right? And parents or grandparents would say, "Oh yes, that's enough here," and they'd pull a 20 out and buy it. How often have we confronted a problem, something like homelessness or the opioid epidemic that we had, or racism or hate, and when we're looking at this problem, it looks like Mount Everest. And you say, number one, I can't climb Mount Everest, but number two, I don't even have any climbing gear. I don't have ropes, I don't have oxygen. This is insurmountable. What can we do when we don't have the resources we need to tackle a problem? Happens all the time, does it not? In your family, at your job, in our community, this happens all the time. You look at a problem, you look at what you have, and you say they don't match. It's too big, it's too much. We have 3 choices. Number 1, we can do nothing. We don't have enough, so we give up. Number 2, we can go around and look for more resources. Write some grant applications, seek more volunteers. I've done that many times. We can do that. Or number 3, you can just say, well, we'll start passing them out, and when they run out, right? You're giving out food at the food pantry, the line is huge, and you say, we've only got enough for like 50. Well, let's just start passing it out to the first 50, and when we get past that, we say, sorry, can't help, right? Those are the choices. We'll keep going. Then Jesus directed them to have all the people sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and 50s. If you know me at all, you know I don't enjoy making detailed plans and having endless meetings. Come to our board meeting on Thursday, you'll hear me run through the agenda. We move it. We want to get along. We want to get done our quarterly business meeting. Let's go. Let's get it done. I'm the type of guy who comes up with an outline and prints a flyer and then says, okay, we're doing this thing. FYI, my wife is the opposite. She'll have detailed plans and everything figured out ahead of time. We're not the same that way. But you need some kind of plan, don't you? You at least need a vague outline of a plan before you start. You know, creativity, gumption, we're all for that, but how are they going to solve this problem? And yet Jesus moves forward and tells them to sit down. Of course, Jesus has a plan. He already knows how he's going to solve this problem. But I think that it's important that he felt that there were two things he needed to do before he solved the problem. The first thing he needed to do was ask the disciples to do it themselves, to let them figure out if they could do it themselves. And then secondly, ask them what the resources they had to work with if they were going to do it themselves. He went through the process of saying, you feed them, how much do you have, before Jesus fixed it himself. And I think that's important. I think that's part of what this text is trying to tell us. And I think those two steps will define the lesson that this is giving us. 41, taking 5 loaves and 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Let me pause right there. First things first, give thanks through prayer. An important and needed step. No matter what we're trying to accomplish, no matter what the next thing is, no matter what the next sentence contains, start by saying, God, thank you for what we have. Thank you for the opportunity to try this. Then he gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all. Don't forget that the them in this, he gave them to his disciples, are 5 loaves of fish to distribute to all the people, and 2 fish to break into pieces for all the people. At this point, you read this and say, he did what? What did he do? How did he do this? And if you're filming this, right, I often think of how this would play out on stage or in film. How do you do that? Does Jesus put the loaves in a basket and then just keep pulling them out, right? Like a magic trick? How does he actually make 5 become thousands? Yeah, at some point it went from 5 and 2 to enough to give to everybody. It's obviously a miracle. Because 5 plus 2 does not equal more than 5,000. I'll let you do the math. Check it out. You with me? Right? Okay, it doesn't work. To understand, we have to step outside of that box that we keep talking about. You've got to step out of the box of our own limitations, our own expectations, to a place where we can see the power of God, to a place where we can seek the will of God, because we know that that will transcend by more than we can imagine what we would otherwise believe to be possible. Notice, Jesus used the 5 and 2, even though they were a tiny drop in a huge bucket. Jesus didn't say to the disciples, your 5 loaves and 2 fish are pitiful. I don't even want them. Here's the miracle. Jesus said, thank you for the 5 and 2. Lord, we thank you for this. And then the miracle happened. He used what they had. You see, our contribution to these problems, homelessness, drug addiction, hatred, racism, poverty, they may seem insignificant. How can we fix so big a problem? But they aren't. Because God can make even 5 and 2 useful. God can make even an amount that wasn't enough for them useful for everyone. Secondly, Jesus included the disciples in the distribution process. The man's working a miracle, right? He could have just said abracadabra and the bread and fish been in front of all the people sitting down, and the disciples just be spectators. But rather than make them spectators, he used them and their 5 and 2, their small contribution, to be the part that made it happen for the people. They filled a necessary role in sharing God's power with the people. he still put them to work in solving the problem. So what's the lesson in all of this? We've got one more piece of the passage, but I think we can see the outline of the lesson right now. And I don't think very many sayings encapsulate this any better than what William Carey said. Those of you who know William Carey, he was a 19th century missionary to India, and he was famous for saying, expect great things from God, attempt great things for God. It's basically what Jesus is teaching them here. Let's look at the last bit, and that'll help us put it into focus. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of bread and fish. The number of men who had eaten was 5,000. The two neighboring villages of Capernaum and Bethsaida had 2,000 or 3,000 people apiece in them. So basically everybody is here, because that's just the men, not the women and children. It would have been mostly men, but there were well more than 5,000 people. And when they got done, there were 12 basketfuls of leftover. Anybody think that was a coincidence? That there were 12 disciples in 12 baskets, so that each disciple is carrying a basket of leftovers. It's not a coincidence. I won't leave you in suspense. It's obviously purposeful, because it reinforces the lesson. 5,000 plus men and women and children were just fed by a mind-blowing miracle, and Jesus makes sure that the disciples realize if it had been 10,000, God could have handled that. We've got leftovers. Leftover fish and bread for lunch tomorrow. That's pretty amazing. So what's God trying to tell us about this miracle 2,000 years later? How can we see something like this in our own lives, in our own ministry, in our own community? Let me tell you a short story that happened on Friday this week. I already shared Tuesday's difficulty at the hospital. I shared Wednesday's trauma that we all saw. But on Friday, something good happened. 8 years ago, there was the beginnings of a dream, a vision, a hope for our community about the homeless situation, about the fact that, yes, indeed, in our county, we have people that are homeless. You don't have to be a big metropolitan area to have homeless people. We have them here, too. Mother Holly, in particular, down at St. John's, was very concerned about that and trying to figure out how we could solve it, what we could do to make that happen. David Jantz and myself and others, we were talking about it as long ago as 8 years, and who knows, they were probably talking about it well before that as well. Others might have been. 4 years ago, an idea that needed nurturing started to take shape. This is a picture of a meeting that we had just on the other side of the building in Latchaw Lounge. You notice you can figure out when this took place because of the back of that handsome man there and the baby sitting on the table. That's Clara. This tells you when this was taken. 5 years ago, in the winter of 2015. That was one of the first meetings to talk about finally trying to figure out how we could get some kind of emergency shelter open. A few meetings later, it was known as Emmaus Haven. And Emmaus Haven started trying to figure out, where can we do something? Where can we renovate? We went down to the old Salvation Army building on 13th Street and realized the building was and we actually did some work up there on the second floor to try to make it happen. But the building had too many things wrong with it. That was an aborted effort. I didn't think about that when I was putting this together. We could have said, it isn't going to happen. We tried, we failed, we're done. And then they had the donation of the house on Elk Street that we renovated. We had the building downtown that was donated that we renovated and turned into emergency housing on the third floor. But that third floor has been full every single day since that opened 3 years ago. There's not enough. We needed more. And then this happened. The fellowship and educational building for the former Our Lady Help of Christian Roman Catholic Church in Siverley. I lived here for years before I knew that Siverley existed, because it's like a dead end off that side of the road in Oil City. I didn't even know there was anything back there, let alone that there used to be a place there that employed 2,000 people. That's pretty incredible. This building was donated to Emmaus Haven. That was a couple of years ago. It was about a year and a half ago. And now this month, that building, after Mustard Seed Missions and other organizations put well over 1,500 volunteer hours into it, now looks like this on the inside. There were donations, there were grants, and there was a lot of hard work to turn this dream into a reality. But if you had gone back 8 years ago and said, how are we going to get from here to there? What do we have? We didn't have enough people. We didn't have enough money. We didn't have enough connections. We didn't have enough relationships. It would have been mind-blowing. Step by step, effort by effort, volunteer by volunteer, this is now a reality. And it will be open in a week or two. At that point, we will be able to say that in the last 8 years, we have added basically 50 beds in our county for people that are in emergency situations. That's 0.1% of the people that live here. But that's about how much is needed on a regular basis here. Between Elk Street and downtown and Siverley and some other places that the county has helped us with, it is an incredible realization. Thankfully, people didn't say, we've only got 5 and 2. We can't get this done. We'll just have to give up on that and worry about something else. Took a number of years, but there it is. So how do we apply this text? What is God saying to us? God is saying to you this morning, see the problem, assess the problem, dare to solve the problem. Because the power of God is capable of far more than what confronts you or I. See it, do something, and trust in God. 5 things of application right out of this text. Number 1, be aware of the needs around you. The disciples looked and said, it's a remote place, it's getting late, the people need food. They were not blind to the problems in front of them, and we need to be aware too of what's going on in our community. Secondly, we need to be willing to be part of the solution. Jesus said, you give them something to eat. We need to be part of the solution. Thirdly, consider the resources available, but don't let them be our limitations. We do need to know what we have, but we need to be willing to think beyond what we have right now. Fourthly, we absolutely need to seek God's blessing upon our service for the kingdom. Before the miracle, Jesus looked to heaven and gave thanks. And then lastly, and here's the part that we all like to be, stand amazed in the presence of Jesus when dreams come true. Just sit back and marvel at what God is able to accomplish.